Hi, everyone, and welcome to the live podcast where we talk all about how to grow food so you can live a bit more of a sustainable lifestyle. And today's episode, I'm really, really excited about. It's something that I can't believe I haven't done sooner, but it's the perfect time for this episode. And that is how to grow in shady gardens, what to grow in shady gardens, how can we utilize our shady gardens to get the most out of them. And a lot of you probably found me through my video, which was on 21 edible plants to grow in the shade. So I think this is going to be really helpful. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into more strategies as well as what actually can grow in the shade. But let me know if you've got any questions. If you are watching this live, just pop a Q in front of the question so I can see it. And let's get started. So in this episode, we're going to do a little bit of a garden update as well. I'm going to share with you. And I actually wrote notes this time because normally I just wing it and I forget. But we have notes. So what's happening in the garden, my highlight of the week, plant of the week, which is something that we're doing every week, just to share a little bit more about different plants that you can grow. Maybe there's something that you hadn't thought about, or maybe it's something that you've heard about, but didn't know different parts about it. So I do love that plant of the week. And then we're going to talk about what's the go with shady gardens. What happens in a shady garden? What problems will come into play? What can we do to really maximize that space and grow as much food as possible? And then we're going to talk about what to plant in the shade. And I will touch briefly on a few different things that I would avoid planting in the shade. But if you do have any questions, again, pop them in the live chat, and I'll definitely get onto those as well at the end of this episode. I'm all cozy. It was raining and I was like, I'm going to wear my cozy knitted jumper, and I just love a rainy day. But now, of course, the sun is out, and it's going to be a beautiful sunset, and the sunset's right into my kitchen, so I get to have a full view of the sun setting every night from my kitchen, which is amazing. But we will also get a little bit of that happening here in the background. So let's jump into my highlight of the week and a little bit of a garden update. So cue the notes. The highlight of the week, I think that is usually like more than one thing, and this is going to be no different this week. There's more than one highlight of the week, but one thing that was really exciting was that I got to do some work with YouTube Australia and New Zealand specifically. So after this live, make sure you go and check out the last two shorts on my channel. I share some tips on there. One is on just my number one tip, and the other one is some edible ground covers. So I got to do those in partnership with YouTube. So that was really exciting for me. Anyway, so I would really, really love if you did check those out and give me some support if you like them. What else? Okay, so confession. Well, if you are following me on Instagram, then you would have seen a little bit of discussion around outside my office window and whether or not I should plant a berry so I can harvest berries out the window of my office, or if I should put a pond in there. And originally, I was thinking about putting a bird bath there, so I'd be able to see the birds splashing about in the bath. I could put a rock in there so the bees could come and drink as well, which, if you haven't seen any photos of my view out my office, it's just the front room of my house, and you can see my raised garden beds, and there's a garden right below it. So literally I kind of feel like I'm in a terrarium at the moment with all the sweet potato. And I was just thinking it would be really cool to be able to pop something for the birds so I can watch the birds from my office and get more distracted than I already am. But I haven't been able to find a bird bath. They're very expensive. And so I was coming up with ways like a DIY one. What could I make? And then I got further down the rabbit hole and ended up at pond. And I was like, a pond could be good. We could do a pond. I mean, what about pond plants? I like, imagine having like lotuses or like water lilies out the view of my window, as well as the raised garden beds and the fruit trees and the birds and the bees. It was all looking good. And so I started to look at what like ponds are on Marketplace, and then I may have got a pond. So new project coming up. I have got a pond. And I did go and try and pick it up in my little Mazda, and it didn't fit. So I did have to get my partner to go and pick up the pond, which he was thrilled about. But we do have a pond. So if you have any pond suggestions, pond plants, things to be aware of with ponds, I would love to know. Leave me a comment. I need to know all the things about ponds, because we are doing a pond next month. It's happening. So I'm going to do a YouTube video on that as I start to bring the pond to life. Somehow. We'll figure it out. No idea what I'm doing here, but pond for the birds and the bees, and maybe some mosquito fish, because I don't want to be breeding mosquitoes in the pond. So that's what's happening, which is exciting. And okay, what else is happening in the garden? I'll just give you a really quick overview before we jump into the shade tips and tricks. The bottle gourd is still cranking. You guys, I have no idea what's going on here. I thought it would have finished by now, and it is currently climbing over one of my raised garden beds, which has shade cloth up. And I've taken the shade cloth off all the other garden beds because it's now, there's not enough sun. We're getting a lot more shade. And that's what this episode is about. As we come into winter, the sun tracks lower in the sky. There's a lot more shadows cast from the house. There's a lot more shadows from surrounding trees and neighboring structures. And if you are on the other side of the world as well, if you are coming into summer, a lot of your deciduous trees that had no leaves over winter now will be starting to shoot a lot of leaves and growth. So those are also going to be putting out a lot more shade too. So I was really hoping to have all the shade cloth off the raised garden beds by now, but I can't with the bottle gourd. It's gone wild. It's got like a second wind. There's so many flowers on it. There's so many fruit on it. The birds are out there every day getting the nectar from the flowers. There's no way I can take this down. So everything that's growing in the garden bed has still currently 3 sides of shade and a roof of shade. So there's so much shade on that garden bed, which means that what's growing in there is going to grow very slowly, and I haven't been able to just like go hard and plant in it because of this bottle gourd, but I can't pull it down. It's thriving and it's doing so well. So we're just going to wing that. We'll see how we go with that. So I have got extra seedlings waiting to be planted out because I'm waiting for that space to plant out, which is I've got some red cabbage. I've got some sprouting broccoli. I've got lots of celery. What else have I got? I think I've got a few beans to go out as well. Other things that have been happening, I've been potting up some of my larger plants into bigger pots because they've outgrown the pots. So I've just been doing a little bit of that. I did get as well some longan seeds. You can't actually see, but they're starting to split. I got these from the supermarket. They were there for $3 a kilo, which I thought was very cheap. So I just got like a handful and I ate them because they're delicious. And I've just had these seeds soaking overnight in water and they're starting to split open. So I'm going to pop those in some potting mix, and then I think I'm going to pop them in some sort of like container so we can keep some of that humidity in to get them really sprouting. But I thought I'd give it a go. Why not? I saw them. They were there. I would love to be able to grow a longan tree. I love trying out growing new things. So that's happening as well. So that is pretty much my highlight and my update of the garden for the week. Let me know what yours is. Everyone's, we're growing. There's things happening. Different times of the year for everyone, for different types of seasons for everyone. But yeah. So let's jump into plant of the week. And again, this is one that I can't believe that I haven't already done or haven't done already. It's one of my favorites. It's one of my staple base crops. So if you haven't watched or listened to that episode on staple base crops yet, this was one of those. And that is, if it will let me go. No. My plant of the week this week is actually the rainbow chard. So it's not actually letting me play. We'll see if we can get that to play. But rainbow chard is definitely a staple base crop for me. It's something that I use all the time. I use it just like I would a spinach. I grow rainbow chard in nearly every garden bed because I like the color, especially over winter when a lot of our greens are green. Having rainbow chard, it's got a lot of color. You can get pink, orange, red, yellow. What else can you get? I think that's it. But yeah, are there other colors? No, that's pretty much it. You can get varying degrees of different, types, like whether that's, very dark red or a lighter red, dark orange, lighter orange, things like that. But I do love growing rainbow chard. It's really easy to grow and it does grow in the shade. So that's one of the things that I have grown in shade as well. It's going to grow slower in the shade, but rainbow chard is a really generous cropping plant. So if you have a lot of freezing for you guys, I feel like my internet or my computer someone is not happy at the moment. So let me know if that's the case. There's always something doing these lives, honestly. Sometimes I think, why do I do this live? But then I really do want to do lives. Are we working? Let me know in the comments if we're still live and working, because something is not happy with my system at the moment. Could just be that my mouse is dead, because this also happens as well. Here we go. We are in. So it is a really versatile crop. So I like to use the rainbow chard in nearly all of my dishes. During winter, I'm popping out into the garden nearly every night, picking rainbow chard, popping it in stir fries and soups. The young leaves I'll also put into sandwiches as well, or into salads. And one of the things I love about it, and this is something that I really love with a lot of things that I'm growing in the garden, is I like to have things that I can just take a little bit from here and there and not harvest the whole plant. So having something that you can just like take a few leaves off here and there just for dinner, that's ideal for me. I would love all of my plants to be like that, rather than just being overwhelmed with something that's like all ready at once. So that's what I love about this rainbow chard as well, is you can just harvest a few leaves as you go. And you can use it for wraps. So it's a really good one to use for wraps. Because of the large leaves, you just need to blanch it first and it softens it, and then you can use that as just you would for any wraps. I also have made some pickled veggies with the stems, and I just love the color of the stems. The color of the stems is what really brightens up my garden, brightens up my plate. It's just one of my favorite things. Okay, so I think we've nailed all that I wanted to say on the rainbow chard. I could literally talk about this plant all day. It's one of my favorites. We do go into deeper details over on the staple base crops, because that is definitely one of my staple base crops. But let's talk about what's the go with growing in the shade. So there's a few things to consider, and we definitely talked a little bit about this in last week's episode when we talked about identifying your shade and your sun. And it's really important for all types of gardening to figure out where the sun is, where the shade is. So one thing we want to determine is our shade seasonal or permanent? So is it seasonal as in like this garden bed gets shade over winter, or this garden bed gets shade over summer? Or does this garden bed just get permanent shade all the time? Those are some things that we want to identify first, because seasonal shade is going to make a really big difference on what we decide to plant in that garden. So figure out if it's seasonal or if it's permanent. Then you want to figure out if it's dappled or dense. So dappled sunlight or dappled shade is going to come from trees. So if you've got a lot of trees around and they're creating more of a dappled sunlight, then there's going to be some plants that will work better in that compared to a dense, if it's coming from a shed or a fence and it's just completely a big block of shade, that's very different to dappled sunlight or dappled shade. So we just want to identify that. And then one of the main things to know about growing in the shade is things are going to grow slower. So this can work to our advantage though, and we're going to talk more about that because we can grow things specifically in that area that are going to grow slower for a reason. So just know that growing food in the shade, it's going to grow slower. And potentially it's going to grow larger leaves. So if you are growing the same things, say for example you're growing nasturtium or you're growing sweet potato, and you have some in the shade and you have some with sunlight, the ones in the shade will probably have bigger leaves, and that's because they're trying to capture more sunlight, so they're naturally going to get bigger leaves to try and draw in more of that sunlight, which again we can use to our advantage if we are strategic about it, which you'll definitely dive into. More water retention. So because things are in the shade, they're not going to dry out as much. So that's something that we need to consider as well, is what is our soil structure like? What is it getting boggy and wet? Do we have correct drainage? All of the things, because it's not going to dry out so much. It's going to retain a bit more moisture because it is in the shade. It's going to be cooler. So those are things we want to consider. And then again, as I said, soil structure and drainage, those are things that come hand in hand with having more water. We need to make sure that our soil structure is great, because if it is not great and it's retaining a lot more of that water, then we're going to end up with some issues around plants rotting or roots rotting or flooding, all those sort of things. We're also going to get more leaf growth. So we're going to get more leaves because similar to the larger leaves, the plant is going to try and, capture as much sunlight as possible. So it's going to probably produce some more leaves than it would elsewhere. So again, this is something we can use to our advantage when we start thinking about what to plant. Pests and diseases. So this is a big one. You're going to run into some trouble with pests and diseases in the shade, and that can be for a multiple of different reasons. One is that slugs and snails, they love damp, moist, wet, slimy areas, and so in the shade we're going to have a lot more of that. So we're probably going to get a lot more slugs and snails in our shady gardens than we would in our full sunlight bright gardens. And the same with diseases. So like our fungal diseases and our bacteria that thrive in a moist environment, we're going to run into troubles with that. And then if our plants aren't as healthy because they're not getting enough light, they'll be more susceptible to pests and diseases. And it kind of turns into this, spiral effect of, if your plant's not healthy, it's more vulnerable to pests and diseases, and therefore it gets more pests and diseases, and then it's less healthy, so then it gets more, and it's just it's a big pile on. So there's some things that we need to consider with that. Now, how do we utilize the space? So if you do have shady parts of the garden, what can we do? This is the answer that you're all here for. So let's just jump into it. So one of the things that I suggest you do is think about vigorous growing crops, things that have a weed-like growth. Because if they are growing vigorously wild out in the sunlight, they're going to have more of a chance of growing in the shade. Hold on a second. My dog has got allergies and he's itching like crazy. Stop. And I can just hear him scratching his feet. It's that time of year, I think, with a lot of allergies for our pets. But so you want to think about what grows really vigorously, what has a weed-like growth, and then can we replicate that in a shady area? Because if something is growing like 150% and you're like, whoa, that thing is wild, that could be actually advantageous to you to put that in the shade, because it's going to slow down the growth and make it more manageable if you're not eating it all, or if you're not getting through it all and you're just like, I have rainbow chard coming out my ears, or the sweet potato has gone wild. Then that's where we can think about planting those things in the shadier parts of our garden to slow down the growth and make it more manageable and actually grow the right amount for what we're eating. And that can be the same with our low-use crops, so things that you don't use all the time. So for example, sage and chives. I don't eat a lot of sage and chives. I like to have them, and I'll use them sparingly, a Sunday roast, or I do add chives into salads and things like that. But for the amount that I can grow, I don't use. Like, I have a wild amount of these things. So those are things that I would plant in a shadier part of my garden, so that I still have them, I can still utilize them when I need them, but I don't have this like massive sage bush that I'm not going to be needing. I have actually got my sage growing under my strawberry guava in the food forest garden, and it does grow really slowly, but it's perfectly adequate for the amount of sage that I use in my cooking. So some of those things that are, it's very dark in here, that are a little bit more low use, I would pop in a shadier part of the garden. And what you want to start doing is figuring out these things that you could potentially grow in the shade, and that's going to free up more of your prime position in the garden. So what we want to do is take those things from prime and pop them somewhere where they can still grow, but we don't use them as often, or we want them to grow a little bit slower. And by popping them over there, then at least, you're freeing up some more space for, if you only have a certain amount of sun in your garden, you can grow the things that really, really need the sun and aren't going to be able to grow in the shade. Another thing is leafy greens. So leafy greens grow really well in the shade. And just how we were talking about before, things are going to grow bigger leaves and more leaves to try and attract more light. And when we're talking about leafy greens, like, that is ideal. That is amazing. That's what we want. So growing a lot of leafy greens in the shade is a really good idea. They are going to grow slower. As we talked about before, things will grow slower. But all we need to do is just plant extra of them, and then we're going to get bigger, more leaves. So we'll talk a little bit about those types of leafy greens, but just in general, leafy greens are a great one for the shade. And also, they don't need a whole lot of energy to produce, and they grow quite quickly. So having something that grows really quickly, growing in the shade a little bit slower, means it's going to be like a normal growth, rather than, something that takes a long time to grow, then we pop it in the shade and then it takes a really long time to grow. So that's a good one to know. Also, we may want to kickstart our seedlings. So seedlings need warmth and light to grow. And as much as I love to direct sow in the garden, if I am talking about a shady location, I'm probably going to plant things in seed trays and get them established before I pop them into the shady garden. And that's because they're going to grow a lot slower, and if they are growing slower, they'll be more susceptible to bugs and slugs and snails. They're not going to get enough light, and it could just turn into a disaster. So if you can get them kick-started, you can get them a little bit more established, have a few more leaves than normal before you pop them into your shady garden, that's going to help them get established and help them have enough leaves to get the sunlight they need to grow. Start sowing adapted seeds. Now, this is a big one, and probably something that's more towards advanced gardening. So if you are just a beginner gardener and you haven't grown anything in the garden, this is something to just think about in the future. But that is, once you have things established in the shade, start saving the seeds from those things that are growing well in the shade. Because the seeds that you were originally sowing with most likely weren't growing in the shade, because optimum growing isn't in the shade. Optimum growing is probably more 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. So the seeds that you are planting and then putting into the shade will probably struggle because they're not adapted to growing in the shade. But what we can do is start to save our own seeds from the garden and things that are growing well in the shade. Next year, they're going to grow even better in the shade. We save those seeds, and we just get this knock-on effect where we're saving seeds from plants that are more adapted to growing in the shade and more adapted to growing in our exact garden and our exact conditions. So that's something to just work towards, and that's something that's going to really help. So a lot of these tips and tricks for growing in the shade are things that we're going to develop over time. It's not an overnight fix. It's probably something that you'll start off, your shady gardens will be a little bit on the average side, and then each year as we develop and we start implementing these tips, they're going to get more and more successful. So don't be discouraged if you do start growing in the shade and it's just not working. Don't give up. We can start implementing these things, and they are going to have a knock-on effect where every year that the garden's going to get more and more productive. So another thing we want to do is improve drainage. So as we talked about before, if we're talking about shady gardens, they're going to retain a lot more moisture. They're not going to dry out during the day. So then if we are getting a lot of rain, it's just going to pile on top, and we're just going to get boggier and boggier, more moisture, rotting plants, all the issues, damp, fungus. So we want to improve our soils and make sure we have really good drainage systems. Maybe we have to divert the water in a direction away from these shady gardens, things like that. Start, putting more organic matter in, putting some sandy soil in as well, mixing it if you do have really clay heavy gardens. That could be something to do. And another thing is prune for airflow. So if we are talking about growing trees in the shade, we are going to retain a lot more of that moisture. We want airflow just so that it's not sitting damp all the time. So we can start pruning our plants a little bit to let some airflow in. And so we're not having water just sitting on the leaves of everything. So things may need to be pruned a little bit more than normal in the shade. And the same with spacing plants out. We may need to space our plants out a little bit more than what we would do in normal sunlight for that same reason, to try and just keep some airflow going, especially when the plants are small and just getting established, just so they're not getting overshadowed when they're already in the shadows. So having a little bit more space around your plants could be a good idea. Grow climbing plants. So this is something I've done. I've got a really big Norfolk pine in the corner of my garden on my neighbor's side. It's not my pine tree, but it's shading a portion of my garden. And one of the things I've started to do is I've planted a passion fruit vine, and this passion fruit vine is growing very slowly. I planted another passion fruit vine in the sun, and that has tripled the size, and it's only been 6 months. And this other one I've been growing for a year is very slow. But what I'm planning on doing is growing this passion fruit in this shady location into a sunny location along the fence line. So it may take a long time, may take longer than I would want, but eventually this passion fruit will reach past the point of the shady tree into the sunlight, and then it can thrive, and then it can start really establishing, and it will be taking up space in the soil in the shade, but it will have leaves going across into the sun, feeding the whole plant. So that's my idea, and it's working really well. It's just starting to get into the more dappled sunlight, and it's starting to take off. I can see the growth is speeding up now. From when it was fully in shade, it's now got dappled shade. And once it hits that sunlight, I think we're just going to be away, and it's going to be off. It's started to produce a few flowers too, so it's a good sign. Thanks, Caitlin, for the super chat. That's amazing. I will definitely answer your question too for later. What we can talk about as well is deciduous fruit trees. So as we talked about in the first slide about defining where your shade is, and is it a seasonal shade or is it a permanent shade? If it's a seasonal shade and it's shady during the winter time, then maybe this is a time that we could start planting deciduous fruit trees. because those are going to be dormant over winter anyway. So they aren't needing the energy from the sun. They don't have any leaves to need the sunlight. They're basically going into hibernation for winter. And then once we get to spring and the sun is back out again, they will have all their leaves. So that could be another really strategic one if you are talking about seasonal shade and we're talking about shade over the winter or the cooler months, is to plant lots of deciduous fruit trees there. And that can be a really good way to do it. And then you're also going to maximize that space for food production. Hold on. Tana, stop. Come here. Boy. Sorry, my dog Tama is really going to town with the scratching himself. He's got really bad seasonal allergies, actually. So another thing we can do is we can reflect light. So having really pale coloured fences or painting things light coloured. Here you are. I know, boy, you got itchies. Painting things light coloured or having light coloured fences is going to reflect the light back onto the plants compared to if that was a dark fence or a dark shed or something like that. So is there a way that you can start reflecting light by using light colours, light coloured mulches, light coloured fences, and that sort of thing to really start to boost the light in that area rather than having it all dark? Other things we can do in this area is if it's just not going to work, if it's just too shady, we just aren't getting the production that we want to get, maybe we can use other systems. So compost bins, worm farms, water collection, storage, ponds, those sort of things could be a really good thing to pop in that area if you want to have them in other areas that could potentially be used for gardens. So I've got my worm farm in the really shady corner of my garden. It's a place that gets full shade all the time, and I think the worms are going to be really happy there. They're going to be really happy there in summer when it's super hot everywhere else, that's for sure. And worms aren't going to want the sun anyway. So it makes sense for me to put the worms in the shady corner of my garden and not be using those anywhere else where I could be taking up valuable space with sunlight. So just think about what you have around in terms of systems, and are they taking up space that could potentially have more sunlight, and move those things to the full shade or the really shady parts of your garden to utilize that area still for food growing purposes. I mean, like worms and compost, those are both really, really important things, but potentially they could have more value or, be used more wisely if they are in the shadier part of your garden. So next up, what we're going to talk about is what to plant in the shade, and what maybe you should avoid planting in the shade. So some of these will be in more detail on my video 21 edible plants to grow in the shade. So I just want to do a little bit of an overview, and also I'll jump into some things to avoid planting in the shade. But before I do want to preface this, and this goes for any of the tips that I share, anything that you see anywhere. There are exceptions to all of these rules. We all have different amounts of shade. We all have varying soils. We all have different, adapted plants. Like we were just talking about the seeds that we're growing in the garden. We all have different seeds and ones that are adapted to different areas. So if you see something that says, don't plant this, you don't always have to follow the rules. So most of the time, the advice that I'm giving in terms of avoid planting this is because majority-wise, it doesn't work very well. But it's not to say it won't work. And this has been proved many times before. I watched a video the other day where I would not advise you to put citrus in the shade, because citrus are full sun-loving plants. It's just not, majority of the time, then citrus are not going to love being in the shade. They get a lot more funguses and diseases. Then the fruit trees start to struggle, and it just becomes this downward spiral. And I had that problem with my lime tree. I planted it in a shady part of my garden and I was constantly fighting to keep it alive. And once I moved it into a sunnier location, it, tripled in size. So I wouldn't suggest planting citrus in the shade, but I watched this video the other day and, they planted citrus at the same time as planting other things. All those other things overgrew the citrus and shaded it out. But because they were all planted at the same time, they all became adapted to the varying shade, the citrus was still thriving. It was still looking very healthy leaves, no diseases, was producing fruit. It was producing probably less fruit than if it was in the sun, but that wasn't a problem to them. And so, it's just really important to know that there are majority tips, or like this is what you would do most of the time, but you can just try things out. Experiment in your own garden, have a go, see if it works or not. And as you start to develop and have things longer term in the garden, they're going to be more adapted and suited. So I just want to say that before I jump into what to grow, what to not grow. These aren't, hard set rules. Please, please, please. Experiment, try things out in your garden, see what works, save the seeds and keep growing, because that is really, really, really going to be the key to success in all of your gardens. But some things that grow generally much easier in the shade are lettuce, spinach and leafy greens. So that's, your chard, your New Zealand spinach. New Zealand spinach just grows like wildfire at the moment in my garden. So I could probably do with growing that in the shade, because maybe I would have less of it and I wouldn't be just like overwhelmed with like I'm pruning my New Zealand spinach and my sweet potato back nearly weekly. Like they are just overgrowing. So I'm getting so much greens, which I am doing some experiments with. I am really excited to share about. But those are some things that are just growing wild and could probably benefit from growing more in the shade, just so I can like maintain the amount of greens that I'm growing. And rocket is something that I don't eat a whole lot of, and it does go very peppery when it's in like hot sun. So growing that in the shade, I feel like it's got a milder flavor. It's much more manageable in terms of how much I'm growing. So it's one that I love to grow in a bit of a shady area. And herbs. So herbs are one of the best things to grow when you aren't sure what to grow, because they are a lot hardier. They are more well adapted to different environments, different growing conditions. So I feel like it's harder to kill them, or like they just don't struggle as much. So herbs are really, really great. Thyme, parsley. If you want to grow coriander, but not a fan of coriander. I think that would grow well in the shade. Sage is growing really well in the shade for me. Chives grow really well in the shade, and you can easily save the seeds from your chives so that you can replant those, and then they will be more well adapted and they're going to thrive even more. Spring onions are another great one, because they're not putting so much energy. A lot of these plants are just putting energy into their greens and not necessarily into the fruits. So if we can grow things that don't necessarily need a whole lot of energy, or they're quicker growing, those are the ones we want to grow. So think about your miniature plants or your smaller plants or things like that. They're going to grow a lot easier in the shade than our full size or like big fruiting plants that take a long time and a lot of time and energy to produce these fruits. The smaller ones will work. Radish, again, grows really quickly and doesn't need a lot of energy to grow. So it may grow slower in the shade, but that's still going to be like a normal time, because radish grows so quickly. Beetroot, carrot, all of those things, and those are some of my filler plants. So I pop them all in between other things. So if they do get shaded out by the cauliflowers and the cabbages, I can still be harvesting them because they do grow quite well in the shade. Sweet potato. Now this one does grow really, really well in the shade, but there are kind of like some downfalls to it. And one is that it's probably going to produce less root or less sweet potato tubers and more greens. So if you are growing sweet potato in the shade, it's going to produce a really, really lush, edible ground cover. It's going to have so much leaf coverage. The leaves are going to be bigger. It's going to be so healthy. But it's probably going to produce less of the root or the tuber. So that's just something that you can weigh up if you do want to use it for the greens crop rather than using it for the root crop. If there's nothing else that really grows successfully in that garden, then growing the sweet potato is going to give you a living mulch. It's going to protect the soil. It's going to give you a greens crop, and it's going to look really lush and vibrant compared to other things that just aren't working out there. So there are pros and cons to these things, and they aren't necessarily always going to be growing to the optimum if they are grown in the shade. But I grow sweet potato really well in the shade, and I just get smaller sweet potatoes or less sweet potatoes. Berries are another thing that you can grow quite successfully in the shade. Berries in their natural habitat are an understory plant, so they are normally grown in forests with large trees, and they get dappled sunlight anyway. So if we look at things that grow naturally as an understory plant, it's another great way to figure out what to grow, because they are used or well adapted to having canopy trees around them providing shade. Vines, just like we spoke about before with the passion fruit, if you could potentially grow something in the shade but then train it into the sun, that way you're going to use up that soil and that garden bed to be able to grow something, but you can actually move it towards the sun to really get that growth going. It may take a little bit of time to get that established, but once it is, then you're going to be away and you're going to be producing food without wasting that garden bed space or that soil space. And deciduous fruit trees. So again, this would be something that we would definitely want to look at if it is a seasonal shade rather than a full, dense, all year round shade. Is grow deciduous fruit trees in the cooler months in the shady parts of the garden that do get sun in the spring and the summer, when they have their leaves and when they're needing those nutrients in that sunlight. But those are some things that we can definitely start to grow in the shade. But if you have any questions, jump into the chat, because we are ready to answer some questions. I know there's a few in there, so I'm really excited to jump into those. And if you also have something that's growing really well in the shade, let me know, because that's also really helpful as well, because we all have different gardens, we all are growing different things, we're all having different success with things that are growing in the shade. And you can see that by my 21 edible plants video. There's so many comments on there with people sharing what's worked well for them. And it's been really interesting to go through those and see what's worked or what hasn't worked for people. I think my mouse may have died. That's why we're running into issues here. It's frozen on me. It's a great thing about these what are they called when they don't have a cableless mouses. I'll just use my phone to answer these questions then. So I did write a few notes as well, because I always run, because I'm doing these lives, I'm not editing them. So when I finish the live, I'm like, damn, I forgot to say that. Or I wanted to share something else and I can't go back and add it in. So I did write a few notes that I wanted to make sure that I hit, so I can give you all of the tips. Oh, that is one. This is one. Okay, this is one. Is if it's a perennial, and you know I love perennials have time to get more established in the garden, and that way their roots are bigger and they're more well established. So growing perennials in the shade is also a really good idea, because they have that bigger root system. They are, able to get themselves established over time and get like bigger and bigger as time goes on, rather than the little annuals that we're planting that have really small root systems. They can often struggle a little bit more. But, okay, I've got it here, you guys. I've got the questions. But perennials is a really good way to grow in the shade as well. You just can't give up on things. They might just take a little bit more time to get going. All right, so hello from Perth. Looking forward to this one as my garden is getting no sun at the moment. What can I grow? So, like we talked about, lots of leafy greens, your root crops, your radish, all of those things. Planted brassicas. Oh, there's so many cool highlights of the week in here. Congrats on the 20,000 subscribers. Yay. I'm also really excited about that. I'm just excited to be able to share more garden, or talk to more people about gardening. I literally could talk to people about gardening all day. So that's always a win. Water chestnuts for the pond. Yes, you guys, I need all the pond suggestions. All right, so we've got Caitlin, question for later. How would you deal with morning sun and morning shade and hot afternoon sun? Okay, so it depends. I guess these questions are all going to be so dependent on how hot or how shady. But what I would start to do is think about more of your larger, more robust things to grow there that can handle that hot sun. So leafy greens do tend to struggle quite a bit with a really, really hot sun. So, sprouting broccoli, things like that, that are robust plants, they can grow really well in like a shady garden, but also gets a lot of hot afternoon sun because they're quite robust plants. And because sprouting broccoli isn't putting all its energy into one big broccoli head, it can handle a little bit more shade because it's popping up lots of different shoots and you can just start harvesting it at once. Another thing is, a lot of your root crops, they'll do quite well with a really hot afternoon sun, as long as you just go through and water as well in the afternoon, because that gives them time overnight to absorb that water, refresh after a hot afternoon, just like us, and then they'll have enough to just keep going through the morning and then hit the afternoon again. If it is something that you are really struggling with and your plants are looking very limp and hot in the afternoon, then that could be something that you could plant there. Is there something you could plant there that's a little bit larger, that's going to give some afternoon shade or some dappled sunlight for them? So we can talk about, layering heights to really start, using the sun and the shade to our advantage. And that's all with just getting to know what kind of sun you've got, what kind of shade you've got. Is it dappled? Is it seasonal? Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Things like that. What else have we got? Can you plant citrus in the shade? I did touch a little bit on this, but citrus are more full sun loving plants, so I wouldn't suggest planting them in the shade, but that's not to say they won't grow in the shade. But what happens with things that are more sun loving rather than shade loving is that they start to get stressed out. So if you are planting, like for example, citrus in the shade, they start to get a little bit stressed out. They're not getting enough nutrients or not enough sun, and they start to get some fungal diseases. And you may have seen that if you see some citrus that have a lot of like a black fungus on them, that's often from growing in the shade. And then once they get that actually blocks a lot of the light as well. And then you start getting more pests and diseases as that tree starts to get more vulnerable. So it is one that I wouldn't necessarily ever suggest planting in the shade, but that's not to say they won't grow in the shade. My lemon tree doesn't get amazing amounts of sun these days because my feijoa is like completely overgrown it. But I need to hack that back as well. I'll be pruning a lot of my trees, and that's something you can do as well, is like prune your trees to let more light in different times of the year when they are needed. Guava moths affected our first crop, was destroyed by them. I don't know if you are in New Zealand, because I know New Zealand is getting really bad guava moths. I think you'd kind of have to do that as a similar thing to a fruit fly. And really the only thing that you can do for a fruit fly is net or bag the fruit to make sure that you're getting some for yourself. And you need to do that quite early on. So once the fruit has been pollinated or starts to start growing, that's when you really do need to bag them or net them. And I do get a lot of questions about that, like, why do I not net my fruit? And that's just because I haven't run into that trouble yet. My fruit trees are still quite young. This year is probably the first year that I'm really getting up a big production of them. And I just haven't had the issues yet. But I know it's coming. It's something that I'm going to have to deal with. But until I kind of have to deal with it, I'm just kind of letting them be natural and not netting them, because I don't want to net as well for the birds. So we're just playing that by ear. But the guava moth is a real bad problem. What else have we got in here? Longevity spinach grows well in full sun and shade in Perth. That's a really good perennial. Honestly, go for perennials. Perennial kale, yeah, that's a great one. Perhaps a dwarf lemon in a pot so it can be moved to sunnier spots. That's another really, really, really good one. Thank you, Alice. That is a great one. So if you can plant things in pots and containers, you can move them towards the sun and the shade. And that's the main reason I have my pellet planters on wheels, is because I was getting a lot of shade in winter in certain areas, but then I was getting really amazing sunlight in other areas, but it was paved and I couldn't plant on it. So I made my pellet planters movable so I could just sort of move them in sun and shade during the summer. Well, in summer I needed to move them into the shade for sure, but then in winter we need the sun. So having things in pots or containers that you can move about seasonally is another really, really good one. And that's going to help you maximize the amount of food you can grow and utilize the different seasonal sun and shade. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that's all my notes. We got through it all, you guys. Normally I forget things, and I definitely would have forgotten something. But I just wanted to have all the information in one place so you can come here and get the information, and you can refer back to this at any time, because as we are starting to grow more and more trees that will get larger, we're going to get more shade in our gardens. So it's something that we're continuously going to work on. We're continuously going to evolve. And it's really good to have a reference point to come back and, find that information in one location. So I hope I've been able to do that for you. I will put together a little bit of a playlist too, so I can, and if you want to watch the video on 21 edible plants to grow in the shade with a little bit more detail on all of those, the link for that is in the description as well. So you can find that there. But as a recap, basically what we want to do is grow things that are vigorous growing. We want to grow things that we don't use very often, such as herbs. We want to grow lots of leafy greens. We want to kickstart our seedlings, improve drainage, improve airflow, space plants out a little bit, potentially grow climbing things into the sun, deciduous fruit trees if it is winter sun or winter shade, reflect light, think about other systems, and plant perennials and save seeds from successful plants so that we can start to grow things that are more adapted to our shady gardens. And then each year they're going to grow back stronger and stronger, and we'll get more and more success from the garden. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I also hope that you get some time out in the garden this weekend. If you've got, some time to start planting out some more seedlings or whatever you're up to in the garden. I have a whole long list of things that I need to do this weekend, but I can't wait to share that with you in the following episode next week. So I'll see you guys all back here for another episode next week. And I probably can't end this because my mouse isn't working. We could just be here all night. Who knows?